I would like to welcome you to the 2021 Grace Adams Tanner Lecture. I'm Dr. Danielle Dabrowski, the director of the Grace Adams Tanner Lecture for Human Values, and it's my pleasure to call attention to the unique significance of this lecture today that was represented in this beautiful video piece by Lee Byers, created by him. Obert C. Tanner was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah, as well as an industrialist and a philanthropist. Of all the gifts he left to the universities, the one he was proudest of is the lectures on human values. The Tanner Lecture on Human Values was formally established at the University of Cambridge, England, on July 1st, 1978. In writing about the purpose of these lectures, Professor Tanner said, "I hope these lectures will contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind. I see them simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values." Each year, Southern Utah University shares the prestige of hosting a Tanner Lecture with universities such as Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, Oxford, and my two alma maters, the University of Utah and Stanford. However, Southern Utah University has the unique distinction of hosting the only Tanner Lecture named after O.C. Tanner's beloved wife, Grace Adams Tanner. Grace Adams Tanner had a strong ties to Southern Utah. Grace was the sixth of 11 children born to Thomas and Luella Red Adams in Parowan, Utah. After studying for 3 years at the University of Utah, she graduated from Southern Utah University in 1931. She married Obert Tanner that same year. She raised their 6 children and helped with the business that originated from a basement and grew into a worldwide corporation. Grace and Obert enjoyed their shared charitable work, creating a legacy of giving for the arts, education, and the public good. As one example of that legacy is the Thomas and Luella Adams Shakespeare Memorial Theater just east of this building, our beloved Adams Theater, which is named in honor of her parents. Grace's academic interests inclined toward the sciences, especially biology and anthropology, fields where she contributed generously. In 1975, Grace was awarded an honorary doctorate from this university. During the summer of 1979, Dr. Eugene Wolfe, who was appointed to direct the Tanner Lecture at SUU, proposed the possibility of incorporating the lecture into an entity to be called the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values. Thus, the first lecture was delivered in 1980 when that center was also established. Dr. Wolfe, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Literature, became the first director. He served in this capacity until his death in 2003. Subsequent directors include Dr. Jim Harrison, Professor of German, and Dr. Kurt Fitzpatrick, Professor of Philosophy. And I would like to thank these directors for the strong foundation they set in leading the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values at SUU. In the fall of 2018, Michelle Lambert, the administrative coordinator of the Tanner Center, and I started planning how to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the center for 2020. And that year looked like such a nice even year with which to start a celebration. However, we had to postpone the 2020 celebration because of the pandemic. Today we kick off what we are calling the Year of Grace, a year-long commemoration of events to celebrate Grace A. Tanner's 40-year legacy at Southern Utah University. To help us celebrate, we are joined by representatives of Grace's family and the O.C. Tanner Company, Stephen Irish Tanner, chairman of the board, and a grandson of Grace and Obert, Scott Sperry, chief operating officer, and Mindy Cox, senior vice president, people and great work. And we also appreciate Dave Peterson, President and CEO of the Tanner Company. And I would appreciate if we could give them give them some applause to please welcome and express your gratitude to our guests. We are so grateful for the continued generosity of the O.C. Tanner Company and the Tanner University's Trust for their support of SUU. Each year, the Tanner Center explores a different theme through the Tanner Lecture. This year, we decided to focus on a book called The Power of Meaning, Finding Purpose in a World Obsessed with Happiness by Emily Esfahani Smith, and drew from that book a concept that she presents called Building Cultures of Meaning. Grace's own writings on her travels that span the globe reflect how much she had an interdisciplinary appreciation of the arts, sciences, and theater while being a strong advocate for education. We also hope to extend awareness of her legacy through the Human Values Certificate sponsored by the Tanner Center. There are many people to thank in the planning of the Year of Grace. The Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Jean Barine, Donna Law, Executive Director of Development and Government Relations, and Sarah Greener from the Advancement Office, Grant Corser, Associate Dean of the College of HSS, Brock Landrum, whose design of the new logo you saw in our prelude piece with that copper medallion at the end, as well as Steve Meredith and Abby Meredith for composing the theme song for our opening that was created by Lee Byers. And a special thanks goes to Michelle Lambert, who has worked tirelessly behind the scenes. In doing research for a speaker who could help us kick off this momentous occasion, Dr. Nalini Nadkarni's work as a rainforest ecologist and science ambassador who takes her expertise beyond the field and the classroom into various communities through the concept of tapestry thinking seemed an excellent fit for our theme of building cultures of meaning. We appreciate her acceptance of our invitation to give the 40th annual Grace A. Tanner Lecture in Human Values, and we are excited to celebrate Grace A. Tanner's legacy through her original connections to Southern Utah University, as well as through her passions for appreciating so many aspects of the humanities. And there will be other events that you will hear about throughout the year. After the lecture, please join us for a reception on the patio, and we will have a special Q&A with Dr. Nadkarni at 2:30 back here in the Gilbert Great Hall, and a copy of her book, Between the Earth and Sky, will be available for sale out in the lobby. I have asked Professor Carl Jarvis from the biology department to introduce Dr. Nadkarni. Dr. Carl Jarvis received his PhD in forest science from Northern Arizona University in 2016, and he has been at SUU since then. He is a lecturer of biology at SUU, where he teaches introductory biology courses, as well as genetics and ecology-related courses. In his research, Dr. Jarvis studies how people affect wildlife populations by altering landscapes through climate change and habitat fragmentation. Please welcome Dr. Carl Jarvis. Thank you.
Thank you. As a grad student in Arizona in forestry, I often attended lectures by distinguished guests, and one time, Dr. Nalini Nadkarni came to visit, and I expected only your typical academic talk that was interesting and engaging, and it absolutely was. It was fascinating to learn about the diversity of these forest canopies. But she offered something far beyond that. She started talking about her work bringing her research to prisons. I thought, of all places, why would an academic work in prisons? She was reaching out to these people. She was engaging people incarcerated in these prisons as collaborators, as partners. She was actually allowing them to be a part of her own research. She spoke about how these people became enlightened by this, how many of them, after their time in prison, went on to go into education, and their lives were much improved by it. Many of us scientists, and many academics in general, feel that there's this too great of a divide between the ivory tower of academia and the rest of human experience. But Dr. Nadkarni doesn't wring her hands about this. She simply bridges the divide, both between the ivory tower and the rest of humanity, and between fields within academia. Dr. Nadkarni is now at the University of Utah. She has received many awards, distinguished awards and grants. She's been involved in PBS documentaries, TED Talks, and The Pinnacle of Science, a guest with Bill Nye. She has published numerous excellent scientific articles and books, and especially of note, the excellent book, Earth and Sky, Our Intimate Connection to Trees. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Nalini Nadkarni.
And my hosts at Southern Utah University, the O.C. Tanner Company, and the Tanner family. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here during the launch of the Year of Grace. I'm also honored to participate in Professor Tanner's profound vision to, quote, together search for a better understanding of human values. I read the biography of Grace Tanner, and I so value her interdisciplinary appreciation of theater, the arts, and sciences in education. Well, I think there really has been no better time than now to put forward these coupled visions of O.C. Tanner and Grace Tanner, because we are collectively walking this knife edge between despair and hope as we contemplate our relationships to the natural world. I think that if we lean too much on the side of despair, we get immobilized. But if we lean too much on the side of hope, we assume that others will take care of these challenges. And on my drive from Salt Lake City, where I live now and work at the University of Utah, I was down to here to Cedar City. I was struck by the beauty and the complexity of the Utah landscape and the many people and projects that are going on to understand and to protect these places. Well, my own studies have taken me to very different ecosystems, tropical rainforests of Costa Rica and temperate rainforests of Washington State. But my efforts to understand and to care for these ecosystems are the same. And I find myself inspired by this very wonderful poem of Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote, "The tapestry of life's story is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever breaking and joining." And this little poem tells me that I must strive to intertwine seemingly disparate ways of knowing to create new ways to care for nature, ways that mimic real tapestries, entities that are complex and connected, that are strong and useful and beautiful. And so today what I'd like to do in my lecture is to present my lecture in three parts. First, to describe the tapestry of the forest canopy. Second, to discuss some of the threads that might connect nature and people. And third, to suggest some transformative actions that we might take to maintain the tapestry of care between people and nature. Well, first, I'd like to introduce myself. My roots to weave together different disciplines actually came from my birth family. My father was from India. He was raised as a Hindu, and he was a scientist. My mother was from Brooklyn, New York, and she was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and she studied Romance languages and communications. So my siblings and I, from our earliest days, we literally embodied this mixture of religions and cultures. And as the third girl of this sort of large and chaotic family, I found joy and refuge in climbing trees in my parents' front yard. And when I was 9 years old, I took this solemn oath that I would learn about and protect trees when I became a grown-up. Well, as a graduate student, I chose to study the forest canopy. And at that time, 35 years ago, the canopy was called the last biotic frontier because it had been so little understood scientifically. But in the last 3 decades, we have developed techniques so that access is not a problem. I'd love to bring you all up there, but I can't do that today, so I'll do the next best thing, which is to show you a small clip from a National Geographic television documentary called Heroes of the High Frontier to show you the joy that you can experience when you go up into the forest canopy of a tropical cloud forest in Costa Rica. This takes place in my field site in Monteverde in the tropical cloud forest of central Costa Rica. All right, how many of you would like to accompany me on my next field trip to Costa Rica? Let me see those hands. Yes! Well, if I were able to take you all up there, I think you would notice immediately that the forest canopy is very different from the forest floor in terms of its microclimate. There's much greater amounts of sunlight, greater extremes of relative humidity and of temperature, and a great deal more wind than the dark, damp forest floor. And sort of in response to this, there's just a tremendous diversity of animal life that have adapted themselves, their life cycles, to live for all or part of their life cycles up high in the forest treetops. You might notice that I've included, in addition to these mammals and snakes and birds and so forth, an image of an ant. And I feel I had to include a canopy ant because my husband, Jack Longino, is an entomologist. He studies ants. He's actually a taxonomist of ants, and he names new species. And when he proposed to me, we met in graduate school in Costa Rica, he said that if I married him, he would name an ant after me. And he did, Procryptoceras nalini, and we've since had 2 children, and he's named ants after them too. So we're perhaps the only family in the world who has each person with an ant named after them. But actually, what was most intriguing and compelling to me were the canopy plants, the so-called epiphytes, the plants that live in the canopy that get support but not nutrients from their host trees nor from the forest floor. Instead, these canopy plants gain their nutrients that are naturally dissolved in rain and mist. When these plants die, they actually create what we call a canopy soil that rests on branches and trunks beneath the live epiphytes. And like real soil, these soils in the canopy provide habitat for insects and even earthworms, just like the soil in your gardens. Well, as an ecosystem ecologist, I was most interested in the ecological functions that these canopy components play in the whole forest ecosystem. And so I have studied this over the last 30 years from the standpoint of nutrient cycling. How critical nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus enter the system, are stored for some time, and then circulate to other parts of the forest. Now, nutrient inputs from outside the ecosystem are especially important in rainforests. And these epiphytes have evolved mechanisms to intercept and retain nutrients that are naturally dissolved in rain and mist. Their absorptive leaf surfaces help them act like nutrient sponges. Some of the tank forms of epiphytes like bromeliads and the negatively charged surfaces of these canopy soils hold on to these nutrients within the canopy for some time, and eventually these nutrients move to the forest floor. When they fall off, they die, they decompose, and they interact and they become inclusive into the nutrient cycles of the forest as a whole. Some of our other studies have shown that the flowers and the fruits of these canopy plants provide important food and nesting materials for animals. We found that 1/3 of all of the foraging visits of birds in the tropical cloud forests of Costa Rica were to the epiphytes rather than to the host tree. They also serve as important habitat for endangered species such as the marbled murrelet, which uses moss bolsters on old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest as critical nesting spots. Well, although we've learned a lot about the forest canopy in the last 35 years, nearly all of this work has been done in intact primary forests, forests that are in the absence of human activities. But I think we're all aware that that disturbance of these tapestry-like systems is now occurring around the world. Conversion of intact cloud forests to agricultural uses has created patchworks of forest fragments and pastures. And at the extreme of forest fragmentation, we can get down to just a single tree isolated in pastures, which potentially isolates these trees from pollinators, from mycorrhizal fungi, from fruit dispersers, to which they were connected before the primary forest was converted to pastures. Well, climate change is also threatening these forests, longer dry seasons, less mist and fog, and this is especially detrimental for those organisms that are dependent on these atmospheric nutrients, like the epiphytes I just described. So a number of my colleagues and I are now studying the effects of isolation of trees and longer dry seasons that are created by climate change in these mountains with a new grant from the National Science Foundation. So to summarize this first section then, our canopy investigations over the last 3 decades have helped us to understand that plant and soil components in forest canopies are diverse, they provide critical resources for animals, and they enhance nutrient cycling. But we also know that these ecosystems are subject to disturbances of forest fragmentation, of climate change, and other human activities. Well, my experiences in the cloud forests of Costa Rica and Washington State let me see that these disturbances coincide with a deeper societal disturbance, the separation, the growing separation between humans from nature, especially in urban settings. So these many years of research really have helped me sort of move further along that knife ridge of hope and despair. And it has led me to think about how I, as a scientist, and I, as a person, might act. What can I do to mitigate these negative effects of human activity on these beautiful, important forests? Well, about 15 years ago, I began to disseminate my canopy research to educators, to conservationists, and to the public. I started a little nonprofit called the International Canopy Network. We wrote articles for natural history magazines. We consulted to National Geographic to make natural history documentaries. And I began thinking, wow, this is all great that a scientist is doing this. But I very soon realized that the people who watch those films, who read those natural history articles, are already convinced of the beauty and the importance and the critical nature of trees to humans. And I realized that I needed to link what others value about these ecosystems, values that may have nothing to do with ecological values. Well, this is a tough thing to do. And so to figure this out, I began thinking about how someone else might convince me to be interested in something that they value that I do not. For example, college sports. I mean, nothing against the Thunderbirds at all, but I myself have never held college sports as something of value to me. But a friend told me that the floors of all basketball courts are made of hard maple, Acer saccharum. Hard maple is a tight-grained wood which lends its hardness and durability to the court. Now that is intriguing to me. So I have become more interested in sports because I now have a connection to it, something that I value, trees. So what are other connections to trees that I might use to intrigue other people? What about young girls? Well, I know that my early connection to trees was climbing the maple trees in my parents' front yard. But what about a child growing up in New York City or Tokyo or Nairobi who may not have trees accessible to them to climb? What might she value that could be interwoven with trees? Well, I hate to say this, but it might be Barbie. It's not my value. In fact, I was kind of horrified when my own 7-year-old daughter requested a Barbie, but I know that Barbie's appeal is universal. And so in 2004, my students and I created Treetop Barbies, morphing this iconic toy to embody the values of being a woman scientist who studies the treetops. Well, at that time, in 2004, I called Mattel with my idea and offered it to them, but for some reason they were not interested in taking it on. And so my students went ahead and made Treetop Barbie ourselves. We went to Goodwill stores and Deseret Industry stores. We bought used Barbies. We dressed her in field clothes that were made by volunteer seamstresses. We created a little booklet on canopy plants that accompanied her, and we sold them just at cost on my little tiny academic website. We did try ground support Ken, but he was not a big seller, so we sort of abandoned that. But amazingly, last year, 15 years later, Mattel and National Geographic Society collaborated to create a line of Explorer Barbies. They asked me to advise on this project, and as a thank you, Mattel created a one-of-a-kind Treetop Nalini lookalike Barbie, of which I'm very proud. But this has led to a bigger approach that I'd like to describe to you. And it's actually much aligned with what Professor O.C. Tanner called a search for a better understanding of human values. This approach recognizes that people will care for what they already see as being of value to them, whether it's a sports car that they wax every Saturday morning, or an engagement ring that they polish every once in a while, or an old-growth forest that they donate money to conserve. It links with a philosophical idea of intellectual humility, that is, putting aside for the moment one's own way of understanding in order to find common ground with others. In my opinion, however, it goes beyond just intellectual humility, and it encompasses what I call humility of others' perspectives through engagement. So for this second part of my lecture, I'd like to talk to you about connecting nature and people using this idea of hope, of humility of other perspectives through engagement. Well, I've told you about the ecological values of forest canopies and forest ecosystems, healthy nutrient cycling, providing resources for animals and birds and wildlife. And so these ecological values then constitute the vertical threads of this tapestry of care for nature. And then my experience with Barbie showed me that I could interweave the recreational or the play values of a little doll as a horizontal line through that tapestry. And what I'd like to do now is to talk about how my students and colleagues and I have woven 3 other types of values into this tapestry of care for nature: spiritual or religious values, aesthetic values, and social justice values. Well, let's start with the spiritual and religious values. Very often, science and religion are placed in 2 very different sectors and spaces. But I learned that 80% of the world's population self-identifies as being religious or believing in God, which is a much higher proportion than those who self-identify as environmentalists or conservationists. So I felt that finding common ground with faith-based groups about the values of trees could swell the number of people with whom we could exchange ideas and solutions. Now, I myself was raised as a Hindu Jew, but I am aware of the central image of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Bible as a central spiritual symbol. And so I decided to investigate this. I decided to use the venues and communication pathways and authorities of religious groups rather than those of academic science in order to forge humility of others' perspectives through engagement. So I downloaded the Old Testament and other holy scriptures from the web, and I searched for references to the words tree and forest in them. Since the followers of that faith they already have faith in those scriptures. For instance, in the Old Testament, I found 328 references to the words tree and forest, all of which related to important uses. And being a scientist, of course, I had to classify and categorize these uses. So of the 328 references, the percent of those citations are there on the y-axis. And we find then that all of these had very, very critical uses to the people who read those scriptures. A symbolic and aesthetic use of trees, analogies to God, practical use like food and shelter, location descriptions, tree loss is bad, and even a few references to tree biology. All were entirely positive, and all were critical. That showed that trees are critical to the well-being of the readers of those scriptures. I also investigated some of the rituals and celebrations of the world religions. For example, I learned about Tu Shabbat, Jews celebrate this holiday. They call it the New Year for the trees. They celebrate it with a special ritual dinner, a Seder, that includes eating the fruits and the nuts of the gifts that trees provide. We also learned about Buddha. Buddha found enlightenment sitting underneath the bo tree. I learned that the followers of Islam look for the word Allah, the form of the word Allah written in Arabic, in the shapes of the branches of trees. And those followers of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints can read about the tree with white fruits, which represents God's love for his followers in the Book of Mormon. Well, I put together all of this information into a sermon I called Trees and Spirituality, and I started knocking on doors of churches and synagogues and temples, requesting the opportunity to give this sermon from their pulpits and bimas. I did introduce myself as a scientist, but one who's interested in what they think and what they believe and what their holy scriptures teach us about trees. Perhaps not surprising, the Unitarians invited me in first, but since then other denominations have welcomed me, and in the 40 sermons that I've given in all kinds of denominations of religion, I have never once felt a conflict between evolution and creationism, because I drew upon their holy scriptures as my authorities. Well, churchyards are considered sacred ground by congregants, and so my students and I have mapped trees in churchyards and created booklets with scientific information about the species of trees that grow in those churchyards, but also any scriptural references to those particular species as well. And we distribute these pamphlets to the congregants. I've also expanded the reach of this work by giving lectures in seminaries for clergy in training. And I've led tree plantings and bio-blitzes on seminary grounds. All of these activities and events have led to an invitation for me to speak to the Archbishop of Canterbury on the topic of environmental challenges and ecological justice. So I was able to provide guidance to the spiritual leader of 85 million Anglicans and Episcopalians. And so weaving together the ecological and the religious values has been very positive and has been leading to connections among sectors that initially seemed very far apart. Well, what about aesthetic values? I think this is dead easy. Artists and musicians and poets have gotten inspiration for hundreds of years from the forest and from trees, just like the beauty that I saw on my way down here in the Utah canyons that I described. Well, my strategy, my tactic in trying to link together and weave together aesthetic and ecological values of trees has been to stage what I call Canopy Confluences. I brought together artists and scientists into the forest canopy for week-long sessions to experience both the scientific and the aesthetic aspects of the forest canopy. We taught participants how to climb. They went up to create their art, their music, their poetry, and their moss collections. And this led actually to further collaborations. I've worked with a modern dancer to co-create a dance called Biome, inspired by their joining me in the field and then expressing their perception of the dynamics of the rainforest to dance audiences in Seattle and San Francisco. We also brought up musicians, a flute player, a guitarist, an oboist, and a rap singer. And the positive response to Duke Brady's rap songs, he was a student of mine, was really enthusiastic, especially among young people. And so that led to a program called Sound Science. What we did was, we were really orienting this towards urban youth and at-risk youth. And, as sort of a frumpy middle-aged professor myself, I don't have a lot of creds with that audience. And so we hired a professional rap singer named Caution to help us. He joined some scientists, and we took groups of inner city kids to marine beaches and to forest ecosystems and other wild places. Caution would pick up a branch or a seashell and just start rapping on it. And then in the afternoons, we brought the students into our sound studios. They made up their own rap songs, and they cut a CD which they could bring home to their friends and their family. So that was sort of changing or transmogrifying then the values that they saw in the forest and on the seashore into a medium that they themselves valued. Well, I think another application of aesthetics is fashion. the beauty of color and style for what we wear. And people value fashion as it's an expression of their identity. We express who we want to be by the clothes we put on when we get dressed in the morning. So people are paying attention to fashion. They value fashion. And I wondered whether I could use this as a way to engage with nature. Now, I recognize that this sounds a little odd and funny for an ecologist to be talking about fashion, because this is what we usually wear when we go to work. And this was actually my first attempt. This is a moss cape that I made. It was really wonderful to wear it, but I always had to stay outside when I wore it to parties because it sort of shed, and it actually grew. Like the second season, it actually got bigger and heavier. And so what my current tactic now is creating a line of what I call eco-fashion, where I use botanically correct images. We print that on fabric. We make a garment of that. We add a hang tag onto that that describes the plant that's depicted on that fashion. And you can see I'm wearing this today, this lovely little jacket. So when Michelle comes up to me and says, "Wow, I like your jacket, Nalini," it gives me the opportunity to say, "Well, let me tell you about this plant that grows in the canopy of the tropical cloud forest of Monteverde." And so it allows everybody then to become sort of a walking educator, conservationist, informer, engager with everybody else who's interested in the aesthetics of fashion. So we've discussed the recreational values of trees, the spiritual and religious values of trees, some of the aesthetic values of trees. What about the social justice values of trees? How can we weave together those components? Well, I've worked in the world of incarceration, which in many ways seems, as Carl mentioned, the antithesis of academia. But there are over 2 million adults and over 50,000 youth who are incarcerated in our country. And they receive almost no exposure to science education. Prisons and other correctional institutions are also some of the most severely nature-deprived environments in which to live and work. And so in 2004, I started collaborating with state prison systems to bring science and nature to incarcerated adults and youth. We recruit scientists, mainly graduate students and faculty, to give lectures about their research topics that range from astronomy to zoology. Now, these monthly lectures are not for academic credit, but they do provide science education values. Through our pre- and post-lecture surveys, we have found significant increases in science knowledge content, more positive attitudes about science and their ability to learn science, and behaviors of sharing knowledge with others, including their cellmates and their visiting family members. We've also developed collaborations with conservation groups to train incarcerated citizen scientists. Our first project involved the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Incarcerated men raised the Oregon spotted frog, a state-sensitive species, from egg to tadpole to adult. And they had an 85% survival rate of these frogs, higher than any other captive rearing facility in the state. Although these adult frogs were then released to protected wetlands to swell the ranks of frogs in these ecosystems. Other collaborations were with the Nature Conservancy to grow rare prairie plants, and Hawkwatch for the inmates to build nesting boxes for the American kestrel, whose populations are declining all the way across North America. We also worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with women inmates to raise the endangered Taylor checkerspot butterfly. Since 2017, we've also been working with incarcerated youth in custody inside juvenile detention centers in Utah. We provide science lectures, we provide art science workshops, and conservation projects with the support of the Utah State Board of Education. Well, for many years, I felt all of this work was really great, really important, really unique. But after a few years, my students and colleagues and I realized that we were not reaching those inmates who reside deepest inside our prison system, who are farthest from nature, and that is the men and women who are in secured housing or solitary confinement cell blocks. Their cells are bare with absolutely no nature at all. The men and women live there for 23 hours a day with 1 hour a day in their exercise room, a slightly larger room adjacent to their cell block. Now, due to high security levels, we cannot bring in lecturers or frogs or plants or soils or butterflies. And so my question was, well, then how do I bring nature to them? Well, I decided to weave in the results of hundreds of psychology studies that have documented the value of nature and nature imagery in hospitals, which is actually another nature-deprived environment. And those studies have found that exposure to nature or nature imagery can speed healing and reduce stress, anxiety, and aggression. And so we've been able to work with a Supermax prison in Oregon. They allowed us to, they provided access to us to provide nature videos in the exercise rooms of secured cell blocks. They provided us with a cell block in 2 parts, with the same risk of inmates, the same officers, the same control room. On one side of the one exercise room, on one side, we showed nature videos for 1 hour a day during their regular exercise time. On the other side of the cell block, we did not show any videos. And after 1 year, we found that men, in response to our surveys and interviews, we found that men on one side, the side of the cell block who watched nature videos, stated that they felt calmer and more connected to the outside. They committed 26% fewer violent infractions than the men on the other side of the cell block with the same risk factors who did not see nature videos. And so this intervention then of providing access just to nature imagery for just 1 hour a day provided value for the incarcerated men, for the officers, and for the institution. I want to add that the benefits of these activities go both ways. Our formal evaluations have documented that participating scientists have become better communicators, better teachers for learners with diverse learning backgrounds. Many of these scientists have become more aware of social justice issues, of mass incarceration, and have taken actions such as writing to their policy representatives, their congresspeople, to increase funding for education for the incarcerated. Well, our team understands that these activities do not fix the deeply ingrained injustices in the US system of mass incarceration. But I believe that it does bring some light to the darkest sides of imprisonment, and it recognizes the value of nature on the nature of humans. It is also something that we in academia can do. And so for the third part of my lecture, I'd like to just touch briefly on what transformative activities scientists and others can take to maintain our walking forward toward the ridge of hope and despair. I've seen that the approach of hope, this humility for others' perspectives through engagement, has worked well to foster exchange with other societal sectors that seem very far from my own tribe of academia. And there are other values that could be woven in, economic values, medical values, indigenous values, historic values, ethical values. All of these are values that you might choose to weave into your tapestry of care for nature. And I think that leads to the question of who else might be sitting at the loom to create a tapestry of hope for those who support these efforts. Administrators, and who might else be weaving this loom? I'd like to describe the ones that I have found so far. Barbie was was one of the weavers at the loom. Inmates, churches, rap singers, all of these belong, but also those who support these efforts, administrators, donors, and philosophers. One thing that we emphasize to our scientists is that small actions can be very useful. Scientists don't have to devote all of their time to engagement, but it can well accompany their work of research and teaching of university students. And if lots of scientists do small things, together we can connect with many others. In fact, when I do the math, I know that there are 325 million people in the United States. There are 6.2 million scientists and engineers. So when you do the math and do the division, you find out that if each one of us scientists has a conversation with just 52 people a year, that's one person per week, then we will have reached every single person in the United States. And I'll give you an example of a small action. This is something I did when I noticed a group of young women who were like exclaiming enthusiastically over each other's manicures. Now, I myself don't really like wearing fingernail polish, but I realized all I had to do was simply go to a nail parlor, ask the manicurist to paint trees on my fingernails with bright green polish. And then when people noticed my nails, I could exchange information about the many values of trees to them and to listen to what their values of trees were to me. Well, another reason I think that small is beautiful and should be encouraged is because sometimes small actions can lead to bigger ones. Our homegrown Barbie became a set of dolls that were distributed globally by a giant corporation. A single sermon led to conversations with a powerful religious leader. A lecture at a single small minimum security prison led to conservation work in over 60 prisons across our country. I'd like to close with an observation that I believe follows Grace Tanner's interdisciplinary view of integrating science and nature and art. Several years ago, I was thinking of ways that I could help people understand that trees are not just boring, sedentary entities that are silent and stuck in place. I realized that when we look at trees at the ground level like this, they do seem static, they do seem stuck. But if we look in the right place, up in the canopy, where leaves and twigs move even in the slightest breeze, we realize how dynamic they are. And to document this, I turned trees into artists by tying little paintbrushes with green paint onto them, and then held up a canvas that allowed the trees to paint for 2 minutes. What resulted was a lovely piece of art. But being a scientist, I wanted to figure out how far it moved. And so I measured the segments and added them up. I multiplied that by the number of twigs per branch, the number of branches per tree, the number of minutes per hour, the number of hours per day, and the number of days per year. And so I came up with an estimate of how far a single 100-foot tall Douglas fir tree moves in a year. And I'm going to ask a question of you. How far do you think that tree moved? This is not a rhetorical question, as I say to my students. Does anyone have a guess? And just yell it out because I can't see your hands. A mile? 10 miles. It's 186,540 miles. That is 7 times around our planet. So if we look in the right place, we can see something that seems immobile that can move huge distances. So I recognize that there is despair in solving environmental challenges, but nothing dispels despair and fosters hope more than movement and actions, however small. And I know there are actions towards understanding and protecting nature, whether here at Southern University's Tanner's Humanities Center, in Utah's canyons, or in tropical forests. And I believe by connecting people with different values and from different disciplines with humility, with systems as formidable as mass incarceration and as small as our own little fingernails, we can move forward towards hope rather than the immobility of despair. I look forward to learning about how this year of grace will help weave the tapestry of science and society and humanities and arts, which, like a real tapestry, creates something that is complex, connected, strong, useful, and beautiful. Thank you.